How was your feast? How was your feast? I saw a good majority of you at the feast this year, which was fantastic. That was a joy. Are you ready to go back to the feast?
Yes.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that.
Can't wait.
I can't wait. Yeah, that's how I feel about it. That's one reason I like to ask people, where are you going to the feast next year? I actually started asking people during the feast this year, where are you going next year? And not that I was planning anything specific. Now, if you were to recommend the feast to someone, how would you describe it? Someone who had never kept the feast before, they didn't understand the concept. How would you describe it? Would you be able to express that joy that you feel in gathering with God's people for those 8 days? All the activities, the music, the food, the messages, just being there together. How would you express that? Do you get that excited that you want to still keep the feast? There's one example of a story where we have people in the Bible keeping a feast even longer because they were so excited. Also, it was the first time that they kept the feast for a very, very long time. In the days of King Hezekiah, after worship at the temple in Jerusalem was reinstated, the nation began to keep the feasts again. Now, since it was the beginning of the year, they had to start at the beginning. Of course, this is the beginning of the year according to the Hebrew calendar, and they began with the Passover. As we know, we have, 27 weeks until the Passover? We're counting down the weeks. Pretty soon we'll be counting down the days. Now, unfortunately for them, they had to wait until the second Passover. Now, the second Passover God gave as an exception for those who were ceremonially unclean or off traveling far from Jerusalem at the time of the first Passover. So this was an exception. Also, they didn't have a sufficient number of priests who had been consecrated soon enough to keep the first Passover. Nor were the people gathered in Jerusalem in time for that first official Passover. So they all came together under King Hezekiah's leadership, as well as that of the priests and the Levites, and they decided they would keep the second Passover. Now, hopefully the year after that, they kept the first Passover, and they were more well prepared. We have to keep in mind that this was an exception due to their circumstances. As in all things that we do, we strive for the real thing, for keeping the rule rather than the exception. Sometimes it's easy to try to make ourselves the exception, but that's not what we're supposed to do unless we find ourselves in some unfamiliar and unusual circumstance. Hezekiah even acknowledged the fact that this was an exception by asking God for his mercy in keeping the second Passover. They were there doing their best to prepare their hearts to come before God. And God honored that. God honored that effort. Even though it was an exception, God honored that effort. And they kept the Passover as well as the Feast of Unleavened Bread with great gladness. I think that's kind of understated. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 30, where we have this story written down for us. Let's see if I can find 2 Chronicles. There it is, after Kings. 2 Chronicles chapter 30, starting in verse 17, we'll read. And we see this assembly of God's people, the graciousness, the mercy of God over these people who are seeking him. Verse 17 in 2 Chronicles 30. For there were many in the assembly who had not sanctified themselves. Therefore the Levites had charge of the slaughter. So here the people were supposed to come bring their Passover lambs and slaughter them themselves, but there weren't enough of them who were sanctified. They hadn't washed themselves clean. They hadn't gone through the ceremonial process of cleansing themselves. Some weren't even, I believe, weren't even circumcised at that point, and they were supposed to be, having made that commitment before God. So they brought the lambs before to the Levites to make those sacrifices for them. And the Levites had charge of the slaughter of the Passover lambs, it says, as we continue on here. For everyone who was not clean to sanctify them to the Lord. That symbolic sanctification that was later realized through the sacrifice of Christ. Verse 18. It says, "For a multitude of the people, many from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, yet they ate the Passover contrary to what was written." Here's an exception. They weren't actually legally supposed to eat of the Passover. And here it says, "But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, May the good Lord provide atonement for everyone who prepares his heart to seek God, the Lord God of his fathers, though he is not cleansed according to the purification of the sanctuary." And the Lord listened to Hezekiah and healed the people. He gave them mercy. He forgave them of their sins. Verse 21, "So the people of Israel who were present at Jerusalem kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days with great gladness." Again, understated. Who knows? There were probably tears in their eyes. They were there rejoicing. "And the Levites and the priests praised the Lord day by day, singing to the Lord, accompanied by loud instruments. And Hezekiah gave encouragement to all the Levites who taught the good knowledge of the Lord. And they ate throughout the feast 7 days, offering peace offerings and making confession to the Lord God of their fathers." So they had this great gladness. They were very excited. God had healed them, it says. He gave them mercy. He reconciled them to himself. And then they all agreed, since this was such a great feast, to keep the feast another 7 days. Boy, I wish we could do that. At the end of the feast, I think I was ready. I could have used some more days, although I probably would have had written a few more sermons at that point. But so they did it again with gladness. Now, it doesn't say great gladness, but we can assume that. They did it again with gladness. They had the feast all over again. Verse 25 describes this here. "The whole assembly of Judah rejoiced, also the priests and Levites, all the assembly that came from Israel, the sojourners who came from the land of Israel, and those who dwelt in Judah." Even though they weren't very unified all the time, they came together to keep the feast, and they stayed another 7 days. "So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem." Not since the days of Solomon. That was a few years before this. At least a few years. Verse 27, "Then the priests, the Levites arose and blessed the people, and their voice was heard, and their prayer came up to his holy dwelling place, to heaven." God heard their prayers. He was already waiting to listen to them, as he is waiting to hear from us. "So they kept the feast again with great gladness." Now this story in the book of Chronicles, recorded here in the days of Hezekiah, should be a reminder to us of preparing ourselves, of starting to plan now for the feasts of God. And of course, we will start with the Passover, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, Trumpets, Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, and the 8th day. We need to start planning. In particular, with regard to the Feast of Tabernacles, there is a little bit more planning, a certain level of preparation, physical preparation, besides the spiritual preparation that we need to begin as soon as we get back from the feast. Or, like myself, during the feast, asking people, where are you going for the feast next year? Now, I have 3 areas that we need to plan, 3 questions to ask you. The first question is, where are you going for the feast? Where are you going for the feast? And we probably have no idea. I don't know, even those who have been to the same feast site year after year, sometimes that changes. Sometimes the feast site changes locations. That's happened before. So who knows exactly where we will keep the feast. But it is good for us to start thinking about this. This builds our anticipation. And when it comes to selecting locations for the feast, when it comes to individuals' choices, once the selections have been made, some people like to stay close to home regardless. They love to travel very short distances. That happens. Others like to go wherever their family is going, if they have family in the church. Lena and I try to at least see family at the feast sometimes. Now, we always see our spiritual family at the feast. Sometimes we might have made very close friends with people that we met at the feast, and we desire to see them again. Maybe we only see them once a year, and it's at the feast. And so we try to figure out where they're going for the feast. We might follow them. And that's kind of neat to think about. Now, our deaf brethren in UCG always, at least as much as they can, try to go to the same site together. And that site changes from year to year. But that's a wonderful thing that they're able to do. They're able to communicate easily with one another and build those bonds that they have, given their unique situation. So we need to plan where we will keep the feast. Now, this planning ahead builds that anticipation for keeping God's feast. We start thinking, what are the possibilities? If you like to travel, you think, well, how far can I travel? It gives us some immediate hope, even though we're looking past the next feast, even on into eternity, on into the kingdom of God. But it helps us to build that immediate anticipation. Now, in this time of year, there can be a post-feast letdown, as some people describe it. It's this feeling of being let down by being done with the feast. It's over. We're back to our regular routines. We're not seeing our brethren every day. We're not hearing that special music every day. We're not feasting, gathering with brethren for fellowship and worship every single day. We can feel that when we're between feasts. But we have to maintain that excitement. Otherwise, it'll only get worse, that feeling of being let down. We need to maintain that excitement. And once upon a time, there were not very many choices for going to the feast. Of course, once upon a time, God's people mostly lived in one place, in Israel. Now, at first, before that, they were wandering in the wilderness. There wasn't many places to go then either. They were just where they were. And they already lived in tents, so they build the sukkahs, the booths, to live in, to dwell in during the feast. God had commanded his people to keep the Feast of Tabernacles later on in a place where he would choose. Now, he didn't explicitly describe that when he first gave the command for the feast. Deuteronomy 16, verse 15, we have here God describing telling his people to keep the feast in the place which the Lord chooses, it says. Deuteronomy 16, verse 15, 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord, your God, in the place which the Lord chooses. So some translations put it that way. Some passages describe it as where God put his name. Or some of them say where he chooses to make his name abide. Wherever God is, wherever he abides, wherever he dwells. And it continues on in verse 15, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all your work of your hands, so that you surely rejoice. So the feast is rejoicing, at least part of the feast is rejoicing because of the blessings that God has given us, so that we can rejoice, so that we can live. Exodus chapter 20, verse 24, you can write that one in your notes, Exodus 20, verse 24, after God gave the 10 Commandments, he instructed Moses further about what type of altar to bring the sacrifices and offerings upon. And he included this detail. He said, in every place where I record my name, I will come to you, and I will bless you. It is ultimately God who chooses where he places his name and with who he dwells. God is, and we should always remember this, God is not limited by location. That's a wonderful fact. God is not limited by location. Now, eventually, God brought his people out of the wilderness. We're not going to go through this whole story. Eventually, he gave them their own land. And Jerusalem, eventually, was established as a place where God wanted his people to come to worship him for his feast days, where they would bring their sacrifices, their offerings. Now, until the days of Solomon, when the temple was completed, this wasn't a reality. But once that temple was completed, and Solomon presented sacrifices, offerings to sanctify that temple, then God's people began to gather in Jerusalem. Let's look in 2 Chronicles chapter 7. So we're looking back at this time of excitement that we read about in the time of Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 describes this. And this happened during the Feast of Tabernacles. It's interesting to think about. They were keeping the feast. God was letting it be known that this is where he chose to have his people come to keep his feasts. 2 Chronicles 7, verse 1. When Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Wow, that would have been something to watch. First of all, this beautiful building that Solomon had built for God, but also God's glory filling the temple in a way that the people could see it. Like that cloud of fire that led the people by night, or the cloud during the day that followed them. Verse 8, dropping down to verse 8, at that time Solomon kept the feast 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt. So a large group of people that took up a lot of space there, coming and surrounding this area, which is not very big. Verse 9, and on the 8th day they held a sacred assembly, for they observed the dedication of the altar 7 days, and the feast 7 days. So they feasted for quite a while. They had a special one-time feast for the dedication of the altar for 7 days. And then they kept the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days, and the 8th day as well. And they rejoiced before God. Verse 10 talks about them being sent back to their tents, joyful and glad of heart, for the good that the Lord had done for David, for Solomon, and for his people Israel. A beautiful time of keeping the feast. So we see God bringing his people into Jerusalem. As we know, God allowed his people later on to be taken into captivity. They could no longer come to Jerusalem. Even further down through history, we see the temple in Jerusalem destroyed, and most of Jerusalem itself, although it was later rebuilt. The temple still does not stand. Many people had no place to go to keep the feasts until to this day there isn't a temple in Jerusalem. And one day there will again be a temple there. And many people will go there to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, today is not that day. Now, today we live in a time where, as Jesus described, when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. We find that in John chapter 4, verse 21. We live in a time where God dwells through his Spirit in his people. And he helps us to find places to keep his feasts, kind of as, in a way, temporary holding places for that time when there will be a temple again in Jerusalem. Now, Jesus further said in the same chapter of John 4, verses 23 and 24, he said, for the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So we worship God, having him dwelling within us, as well as his Son. And we are led by Jesus Christ through that same Spirit to go, to move, to preach, to live as we are instructed. Now, Jesus Christ is the head of this spiritual body that dwells within us. And he's given some to be administrators, pastors, teachers, those who have been given authority to and the responsibility to find locations to keep the feast. I've never been given that responsibility except once in Malawi. And that was also the only time that I ever kept the feast in the same town that I lived at the time. So that was unique. But it's a big responsibility to find locations. And those who have that responsibility pray and fast about it so that God can reveal to them where would be a good place to have the feast. They diligently search as well, doing their part. Sometimes locations are found where there are a lot of God's people living close by. Sometimes it's a place where we find God's people gathering year after year, regardless of how far away they live. And they have gathered in these places for many years in our modern times. These are places where it's easy for large groups to gather. Maybe it's a beautiful location, away from all the distractions of the world. Sometimes places are chosen because it's too difficult for a whole congregation to travel very far. And so a closer location is found, such as some of the sites that we have in Malawi and Zimbabwe. There's one in a village. It's difficult for people to easily travel. They Travel on ox carts. It's tough travel that way. I've never traveled by ox cart, but I've seen it done, and it's not very fast. It might take you a week to get to the feast. Then you'd feast, and then it'd take you a week to get back. So instead, if we have enough people, we have locations that are nearby. Sometimes our feast sites are placed where there's a large group of people who can no longer travel very far because of age, because of health, but they're still able to congregate together for the feast. Now, cost, unfortunately, is another factor that is considered when it comes to choosing a feast site. There are some times where God makes it obvious that we can no longer, should no longer keep the feast in a particular place because it just costs too much. It just costs too much for the meeting halls and the accommodations, buying food. Everything would be too much for people to pay for the church to be able to pay for collectively. And also, sometimes there are safety concerns. Now, this year, those who kept the feast in Israel traveled around, and they were safe. God kept them safe. But almost as soon as the feast was over, it was before the feast was actually over, there were difficulties, there were problems. Safety was then a concern. Now, who knows if God's people will gather in Jerusalem, at least those from UCG, next year, to keep the feast in Jerusalem. I'm not sure. Of course, things could change, and it could be a very safe place, a relatively safe place again. Regardless of what is happening in the world around us, we are to plan to keep God's feasts. We must. We must still plan to travel where God has chosen his people to go. We must not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. Now, when it comes to planning for the feast, and by the way, we're still in this first section here, where will you go for the feast? We have to budget our time. I think most of us are pretty good about budgeting our time when it comes to planning for the feast, although sometimes it's a struggle. Now, this also comes into our planning for our location. Of course, if we don't have the time to go very far to take extra time, we might choose to go somewhere close by. Many of us have to take vacation time from work to be able to keep the feast. And this can sometimes be a battle with the boss. Because the boss, they are trying to run a business or whatever it might be. And if they have somebody who's gone, especially somebody who's important to them, it hurts. It hurts their business. So they have to be willing to let somebody go for a while and come back. Now, the church does have a letter you can get from your pastor that briefly explains the feast and also requests an excused absence from school or work so that you can go and keep the feast. We also pray and leave it in God's hands. Now, you'd think in a place like New York City, people would be used to people taking time off for religious observation, but it still seems to be a struggle for some at times. I went through some of those battles for many years. For a long time in school, trying to explain to my teachers, it's going to be fine. I'll still learn the information. This is better for me. And I would go anyway, and then come back and catch up. Everything would be fine. When I actually started working, once I was an adult, I thought I was an adult. I'm still working on it. I had to go through that battle with work. I worked at a school. And I'd be off for the summer, 3 months, and getting paid through the summer. And then we'd be back at school for maybe 2 weeks, and then I would have to leave again. Take a week off. And always my boss would think, well, why are you doing this? Why couldn't you do this during the summer? Well, that's not God's calendar. You try to explain things to people. There were many times where I had to take unpaid time off for the feast in those circumstances. And Lena and I had to plan for that. And we had to budget our time as well as budget our funds so that we could keep the feast. And God makes it worth it for us in those times. He takes care of us. If we lose a job, God has a plan to provide us another one. I've heard many stories about God's people not having a job when they left for the feast. And they came back and God provided them with something better. And we have to do our part in planning our time, making sure that we don't compromise our commitment to God. That's our responsibility, and that's a decision that we have to make. Sometimes, we try to look for the exception, but we aren't the exception. We are not the exception. We are God's people, and we are committed to him, and we don't make those compromises. So where will you keep the feast next year? Hopefully you have an answer later on. I'll ask you again later. Now, secondly, how will you get to the feast? How will you get to the feast? Will you drive? Will you take the train or the bus? I've never taken the train to the feast. Maybe a bus. I can't remember. Is there somebody you can catch a ride with? Maybe you'll fly. Maybe. I don't know if we'll walk to the feast next year. I don't know if we'll have a feast site that close, but it's happened before. Now, even though most of our basic, much of our planning, or some of our planning has to do with transportation and where we'll go, most of our planning ahead of time in how to get to the feast is keeping our second tithe, keeping our tithe. Now, the Bible does describe 3 different tithes. And we're not going to go through all those 3 today. But they are each 10% of our increase, our income. Now, first and second tithe are similar in the fact that they're kept every single year. Third tithe is a little bit different. Again, we're not going to go into that today. Everybody's income is different, but that 10% of your income is still your 10%. Your 10% is going to be different than my 10%. We each have that responsibility to keep 10%. And it's an easy math. God gave us easy math to do. I'm so thankful for that. No complex calculations. God expects us to save that 10% of our increase so that we can faithfully keep his feast. If we've made that commitment to God, we say, I'm going to go and keep his feast every year. That means we're also making this firm commitment to keep our tithes. And maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. That's fantastic. But this is just a reminder for us. Now again, there are some exceptions, but we don't look at ourselves as those exceptions to the rule. We look to what God says to do, and we strive for that, unless we find ourselves in some strange, unusual circumstance. Now let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 14. Deuteronomy 14 is where we see described what we call second tithe. And we see it as second tithe because it's not the first. The first goes to the work of the church. Then, at the time when Moses was given these instructions from God, the church, well, it wasn't the church. It was the nation of Israel. It was the spiritual matters, taking care of the spiritual matters, the worship at the tabernacle and later on the temple. And also caring for those who didn't have any income for themselves, the priests, the Levites. They didn't have their own income, their own increase. They were taken care of by this first tithe. Deuteronomy chapter 14 describes, however, a different tithe that has a different purpose. Even though it doesn't say second tithe, we see that it is used differently. Verse 22 in Deuteronomy 14, you shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. So if we are farmers, we would tithe our grain. And if we needed to, we would exchange it for money so we could go and keep the feast. In verse 23, and you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide. We see similar language that we read about keeping God's feasts. And this is a tithe that is eaten. In other words, we feast on it. We use it during the feast. The tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil, of the firstborn of your herds, of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Part of tithing is learning how to fear God, how to trust him, how to give him reverence in our lives. Tithing helps us to build our trust in God. It's a test of our faith, always, regardless of how long we've been doing this. Verse 24, but if the journey is too long for you so that you are not able to carry the tithe, could you imagine if we had to carry all of our food with us to the feast? We'd save 10% of our grain all year and pack it on the ox cart, put it on the donkey. Let's go down to Jekyll Island. Could you imagine that? That's a bit far. And so, if that's the case, it says, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. So God gives us this responsibility to hold on to that. Whether our tithe is in grain or whatever we might produce, or as is common in our time, our world, money. And that's our responsibility. In verse 26 here we see this description of rejoicing before God and what we do with that tithe. And you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink, for whatever your heart desires. You shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. You bring everybody with you. You don't leave anybody behind. That's the idea. Now, people sometimes look at their situation as an exception, and they have taken of their second tithe to cover bills when there's emergency expenses that come up. But again, we don't look to ourselves as an exception. We have to realize and make that commitment that God will provide for us, so we don't dip into God's money. First tithe seems a lot more clear-cut. In fact, usually we send it into the church instead of holding it back for ourselves to watch, because we know that's God's money. If I hold it too close, maybe I might spend it. That's God's money. Well, it's the same with second tithe. Until we get to the feast, it's the same. Maybe it'd be a little bit easier if we had somebody else keep our second tithe for us. Some places they do that. They might have like a church bank account. They say, okay, I'm keeping this much in the bank account. Here, you take care of it. I know I'll spend it. Now, it's more important for us to have that responsibility and to take it seriously, to build our faith. Now, if we've faithfully kept our tithe each month or each week, however we calculate it out, we should be able to estimate how much we can spend. Now, this is done through budgeting, putting together a budget for the feast. That doesn't sound like the fun part of the feast, but actually it can help us anticipate the activities that we can do, the places that we can stay, the food that we can buy, the meals that we can share with our brethren. If we budget out how much we have, how much we'll anticipate having, we can make those plans. I always tried, all my life, once I was old enough to have my own tithe, I tried my best not to see a budget as a limitation, but as a plan for how I might spend the feast. I also keep in mind at the feast that we have the opportunity to help others enjoy the feast with our blessings. Now, if we don't have enough to go beyond our housing and enough food that we can get by, that's one circumstance. We might not be able to take everybody out for a meal. Sometimes we are the recipient of that sharing, and that's not a bad thing. But sometimes we have been blessed to be able to bless others. We have to remember that. In those moments when people help us, or have helped us in the past, we can remember that blessing and appreciate it, and also learn to do the same, to bless others with what God has blessed us. If we fail to budget, sometimes that happens. We don't budget properly. We think, I'll have plenty. Well, there's always things that come up. Unintended expenses do come up. If we don't plan, we might not have enough to make it home after the feast, and that would be a problem. I've seen that done before. And then you have to call your family and say, I'm stuck, wherever it might be. I'm stuck in Ocean City, Maryland. It's so terrible here. It's sunny, there's beaches, but I'm stuck and I can't make it home. In that respect, we have to be wise with the blessings that God has given us as we strive to be blessings to others. We are supposed to be good stewards of the blessings God gives us. So have we begun planning how we will get to the feast, and also what we will do at the feast? And that's the next one. What will you do at the feast? It leads right into this next one. What will you do at the feast? Of course, budgeting, helps us to make those plans for the feast. And we ask ourselves, well, what do I want to do at the feast? We calculate, this is how much I think I'll have, even though I just started saving again, my second tithe. But you can see it building up. I love watching it building up. And you can say, oh, wow, look at this. God has blessed me this much. I'm going to be able to have 2 meals a day or something, whatever it might be. I'm going to be able to eat breakfast this year at the feast. And we began making plans. Now, as a child, I had certain priorities that I had worked out when it came to the feast. Swimming was one, usually, although some places didn't have a pool. Eating special foods was always exciting. Things that your mom didn't cook. Or, going to restaurants that you only got to go to during the feast. That's kind of exciting. I loved also seeing my friends, although sometimes I would find myself at feast sites where I had to make new friends because there wasn't anybody my age that I knew. Now sometimes we camped at the feast, and so our activities were a little bit different. One of my favorite feasts from when I was a child, we stayed in a camper, not in the wilderness or anything, not in the trees, but there was this some kind of convention hall. Not where they were having the feast, but it was next to where they were having the feast. A lot of blacktop, but I got to bring my bicycle, and I rode my bicycle every single day. I only got hurt once. There was this big dog there that you could go and visit, somebody's dog who was also keeping the feast, and I enjoyed it. I have different priorities somewhat these days. I don't ride my bicycle at the feast much. Maybe I should. Maybe I should get a bicycle. I'll just take it with me. I still look forward to seeing my friends or meeting new friends. One of the most exciting parts of the feast for me these days is meeting God's people. I love meeting God's people from different places and seeing people that I haven't seen for a long time. I had the chance to do that this feast. There were a few people there that I grew up with, and I had the chance. I didn't get to spend much time with them, but I got to see them again after a long time. That was exciting. I also like being part of as many activities as possible. And maybe you're not quite that way, but we only have 8 days, and so in my mind, we have to do as much as we can and see as many people as we can. And with larger feasts, there's always something going on. There's one day in particular of activities, usually, that I especially like. It's Family Day, because you get a lot of people there. You see families with their kids, and it's a lot of fun. I enjoy that. There are other activities I enjoy as well. But have we planned what kinds of activities that we want to do next year? And we can look back and say, well, maybe there was something that I missed, some place in this location, in this feast site that I didn't go and see. Maybe there's a particular restaurant that we didn't get to go to. Maybe it was closed or too busy or something like that. Or maybe there was a certain friend that we didn't get a chance to spend as much time with as we wanted to. Are we ready to go again and make those plans, to rejoice at the feast together with our brethren next year? Now, aside from just all the fun and activities, one of the benefits of the feast, as I've grown older, I've realized this more and more, is the chance to serve alongside our brethren. We have the chance to serve alongside our brethren. Of course, we serve alongside one another here every Sabbath, and that's a wonderful blessing. Serving alongside brethren at the feast gives us a chance to serve in ways that we might not get to regularly. It's also an opportunity for bonding. Sometimes we're serving with somebody every single day if we have a certain responsibility, whatever it might be. It's a chance for bonding, for growth as well, our own growth, our own spiritual growth, sometimes physical growth. We learn new skills. Regardless of the size of the feast site, in order for everything to run smoothly, it takes manpower, it takes volunteers to do the work. If everybody pitches in and does something, everything works smoothly, everything gets done, and everybody can have a wonderful feast. Now, when we're willing to step up and serve, we have a chance to help everything go smoothly. I love that. I might not be able to do it by myself, probably not actually, but if I can help out, that makes me feel good. That makes me feel good to know that other people are able to enjoy the feast. Now, Jesus Christ, of course, set the ultimate example for us of this service. And of having joy in serving others. It brought him great joy to come and to serve us and to set that example. How seriously do we take his example? How seriously do we take it upon ourselves to follow that example, to listen to his instruction to serve one another? Matthew chapter 20, and also to find joy in it, which sometimes that's the most difficult part. Matthew chapter 20, we see Jesus Christ's attitude and his purpose. Keeping in mind that here we have God in the flesh coming and speaking these words. Matthew 20, verse 25. And Jesus called his disciples to himself, and he said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, They're people who like to have control over other people, tell them what to do for the sake of having power. And those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. That's a powerful example. And we should apply this all the time, every single day in our lives, including at the feast. Sometimes we show up to the feast and we think, I'm just going to relax. I'm ready for a vacation. Well, the feast is not a vacation. There is a lot of rejoicing. It's enjoyable. There's a lot of feasting, and we're supposed to enjoy it. But it's not a vacation. It's a commanded assembly of God's people together, to rejoice together, to work together, to learn how to serve. We are preparing for serving those who will come and keep the feast in the millennium. So we are practicing that service now, and we will teach them how to serve at that time when they come for the feast. So how will you plan to serve at the feast? That's a question for us in our planning. I made a quick list of just some areas that are often needed for people to serve in. Of course, there's special music, joining the choir. That's something that I always enjoy doing if I can. Although then you have to show up for choir practice. That's a whole other commitment there. But it's worth it. It's a lot of fun. There are teen choirs, children's choirs, and adult choirs, small groups, individuals singing special music. That's a blessing. It's a blessing to everyone at the feast to serve in that way. There's also ushering. For those of us who might not like to get up in front of people and sing, or maybe you don't think you can bring a joyful noise. There's ushering, special services, lots of opportunities to help people who need help, even on a physical level. There's greeting. One of my favorite jobs in the church growing up was greeting people, opening the door, just saying hello, happy Sabbath. If I could do that all the time, that'd be fantastic. So there's greeting, information table, helping people figure out what activities they are doing. There's the offering count. If you're really ambitious, you can volunteer or be volunteered for business office, counting the money, all those kinds of things. I leave that to Lena. She remembers details better than I do. There's helping run events. That's something that's needed. Plan events and run them, whether you're running it yourself or helping somebody else to run it. That way the events can happen smoothly and there isn't chaos. There's song leading and speaking that needs to happen at the feast. There's also taking care of the needs of others, making sure that those who maybe they don't have any friends, maybe it's their first feast, they don't know how to feast yet, helping them to understand what the feast truly means, spending time with them. We aren't to be the ones sitting back waiting for somebody to come up to us and ask us how our feast is going. We are supposed to be the ones that take that first step, that effort to go and meet our brethren. That can be a little daunting. We don't know if they're going to like us or not, or get along with us, even though they might love us. We're brethren. But maybe they won't get along with us. We don't know. But we won't know until we get out of our comfort zone and go and speak with them and build those bonds that begin today but will last on into eternity. We love the Feast of Tabernacles, and we should. It's a wonderful gift from God. It's a time for God's people to step out of this world for 8 days, a reminder of the hope of the future, a world without wars and fighting. It looks forward to a time when God's kingdom will be on this earth and a time when we will be able to rejoice together with Jesus Christ and later on with God the Father on the earth and teach others to rejoice, keeping the same feast. And do we maintain that excitement by starting our planning now? Are we planning where we would go for the feast? Are we thinking about those things? We can pray that God guides the administration of the church in finding these locations that He desires us to keep the feast. We can pray for the festival coordinators who organize all the things. We pray that God gives us and our brethren the physical and spiritual stamina to attend the feast, physically, to go there. And we have to plan to keep the feast next year. We plan where to keep the feast. Secondly, are we faithful in tithing so that we might be able to go to the feast? We make a commitment between us and God, saying that I'm not going to compromise this commitment. We set aside our 10%, our second tithe, so that we might keep the feast. If we do this without compromise, of course, if we still don't have enough, there are funds available that come from the church, although those funds actually come from faithful brethren who maybe they had enough to share, so they send it in to the home office and they share. And we can do the same. Or if we know people who are running low on their tithe, we can share our tithe. If we have plenty, what do we need it for? An extra meal? You can only eat so many meals at the feast. So we have to plan to save for the feast so that we can rejoice together with our brethren and share in that rejoicing. Lastly, are we ready to rejoice and to serve at the feast? Are we making those plans? Saying, I'm going to make a commitment to try serving in a different way that I've never served before. I'm going to plan activities. I'm going to plan to do some activities with other people. I'm going to plan to serve alongside my brethren, to build those bonds, to help others to be able to enjoy the feast, help everything to be able to run smoothly. So we have to plan to serve and rejoice next year at the feast. If we start this preparation now for next year, and year after year, we can truly have a feast worthy of staying an extra 8 days. Although, that usually doesn't happen. But still, let's plan to keep the feast. And let's plan to have the best feast ever.